good afternoon. If you're listening to the 4C Dialogue with me, Zarni, as the host, and Professor Rafal Pankowski from Warsaw. He is a professor of sociology at the Institute of Sociology there at a reputable institution called Collegium, Civitas. In plain English, it would be civic college or civic university. Rafal, welcome and thank you so much for doing it. It's really an honor that you agree to share your thoughts as a Polish intellectual, self-critical, critical of your own country's ideological trends. And also you are vastly knowledgeable about Southeast Asia, violence, racism, and states across Southeast Asia through your collaboration with universities in Bangkok and Phnom Penh, and also through your travel across the region, as well as through your work with Southeast Asian human rights frontline activists. And so welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It is a pleasure.
Yeah. Can you, before we get into the issues of how states, as in political organizations with the ultimate control over territories and populations, including the control of the armed organization, police, law enforcement, national armed forces, militias, and whatnot, how these institutions use popular prejudices that are natural to any given social organization to further their political and strategic ends. Can you give an overview of the a symposium that you organized with the university in Phnom Penh, as well as Chulalongkorn University, one of the research institutes, and I participated in it. Unfortunately, I was unable to attend all the sessions, but you got such leading the scholars in genocide, I feel like Ben Kiernan and others from around the world. And can you give an overview of what motivated you to bring your knowledge of genocides, fascism, racism, and radicalism to Southeast Asia?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the symposium itself and the project behind it, and then let's go back to the issue of the state as a perpetrator of genocide, if that is okay. The symposium lasted 4 days. It was organized by the Never Again Association, of which I am a co-founder, and our team, led by Natalia Siniaeva, in cooperation with the institutions you mentioned, the Balak program at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, the American University of Phnom Penh, as well as Heinrich Bell Stiftung, Cambodia. The symposium lasted 4 days, so it was quite a big and rich program with global participation that actually went beyond our expectations. We had more than 1,200 registered participants, and we literally had contributors, presenters, moderators from all over the world, including yourself, for which we are very grateful. And the symposium was a part of a larger project, which is still ongoing, which is implemented by the Never Again Association, focusing on 3 countries in Southeast Asia, namely Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia, in partnership with civil society organizations and academic institutions in all these countries. And the idea is to inspire dialogue and exchange. We have the support of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an international organization devoted to the memory of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is the starting point for the discussion, but it is not the end point. So what we aim is to inspire discussion and debates about identifying and confronting genocide denial and genocide distortion, and to inspire critical debates about dealing with the past. And of course, that means a lot of different things in different contexts, but there are also many similarities between those different contexts. And I think that the more we debate it, the more we discover both the analogies and, of course, differences. But I think there are just so many fascinating tropes and parallels between the history and the present challenges of East Central Europe and Southeast Asia. And I think one of the best things about this project is the building of the bridges between East Central Europe and Southeast Asia in this field of Holocaust awareness, genocide awareness, as well as dealing with the past in a meaningful way, including combating denial and distortion of history.
As you know, because your country, Poland, that lived under the Nazi occupation, and I have made so far 4 trips to Krakow, to visit Auschwitz, to have some discussions with the museum officials. The officials at Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, mentioned to me that, as well as in their public statements, that the genocide, the Nazi genocide or the Holocaust, is not simply about history. They want it to be relevant to today's, situation where, populist, especially right wing. In the past there were populist left wings, but today most of the populist, dangerously populist regimes are rightist in orientation. Can you give your own expert analyses on the role of the states and how they use ideologies, as the vehicles for mobilizing majoritarian public opinion against usually vulnerable, non-threatening national minorities? I mean that we still look at Nazi genocide, for better or worse, as some kind of a standard. Obviously, that's problematic, right? As you said, there are a lot of similarities and commonalities in this phenomena that has been named by Raphael Lemkin as genocide. Yeah, the destruction of a group. And so that is in international law, and as well as sociologically, a crime against humanity. In other words, attack on one group of fellow humans is actually attack on all of us. Yeah. So I was very, very happy that you and Natalia and others accomplished what I wanted to do, but was unable to do so far, which was to link the genocides in other parts of the world, particularly Western Europe and Eastern Europe, with Southeast Asia. And finally, I am from Burma, and I grew up in Southeast Asia, traveled and worked there. But a lot of people are in the region appear to know more about the Nazi genocide, the extermination of the Jewish people and other victims of Nazi genocide, than they do about Khmer Rouge, yeah, which is like the genocide in our backyard in Southeast Asia. So, what do you find, the commonality among these states, Nazi states, as well as Khmer Rouge, the regime, and Burmese regime today against Rohingya, China?
Well, you see, the motto of our organization, "Never Again," I think can be, an interesting point of reference here. For us, it mostly means commemoration of the Holocaust, but also it also means our position vis-a-vis the contemporary issues that you already described, the issues of contemporary anti-Semitism, xenophobia, extremism, intolerance, etc. But in Southeast Asia, starting with Cambodia, the motto "Never Again" is well understood, with its own context in the relatively recent history of the country. In Myanmar, the context is even more recent. It is very contemporary, as you know very well. In other countries such as Thailand, "Never Again" is also understood as a universal motto, but with a specific national application. So it is very much related to a lot of different experiences of a lot of different countries. And I think this is what inspires us, and this is what allows us to build solidarity and empathy on an intercultural level. And now, going back to the role of the state, which you alluded to, which I agree is important. Well, without going too deep into the philosophy, what the state is and what it should be, definitely we can say that the state can be a very dangerous actor in this. And the history of the 20th century, as well as the 21st century, is giving us plenty of tragic examples. On the other hand, of course, the state can be a positive actor too. Speaking from the so-called Polish point of view, well, I am very well aware that the struggles for an independent Polish state were struggles for emancipation, and that is also important to note. But definitely, the state becomes a dangerous actor when it employs what you may call the technique of otherness. So when it relies and promotes, it relies on and promotes an ideology of exclusion, which I think in most cases is an ideology of ethno-nationalist identity. Sometimes or frequently amplified by religious identity or denominational identity. And we have seen this mechanism in Europe. We have seen this mechanism in Asia too. And I think, again, this is one of the many analogies that that exist. So historically, Poland used to be a very diverse country, a very diverse society, a diverse nation, possibly the most diverse in Europe historically. Well, since World War II, since the Holocaust and ethnic cleansing and deportations, change of borders, Poland paradoxically became one of the most mono-ethnic, culturally uniform societies in Europe, which is a big contrast to what Poland was historically. And first, the communist regime, but I think to a large extent the current regime in Poland seeks legitimacy through through the ideology of monocultural nation, which is linked to the idea of Roman Catholicism as a marker of identity, which leads to an exclusion, a symbolic or legal exclusion of minorities, of those who are not, so-called true or truly Polish or truly Polish Catholics. This is not to say that minorities in Poland don't exist, but they are relatively marginal, both statistically and socially. And I think that the very latest example of how dangerous and even tragic this ideology of exclusion can be on the state level, on the institutional level, is what is happening just now on the Polish-Belarusian border, where hundreds and thousands of refugees are located, trying to enter the European Union, and they are prevented from entering Poland by the Polish police and military, and they are stuck in a no man's land in freezing cold, and people have died, including children, in a way that is completely unacceptable. We might think that would not happen in the heart of Europe in the 21st century, but it is happening in front of our eyes, and I believe it is a direct result of the kind of ideology and the mindset of exclusion that has become dominant again in the last years in some of the European countries. So I believe everything we are talking about now has a historical aspect, but it also has a very contemporary aspect too. But I would like to add a little footnote, maybe. I would say it's not just states that could be perpetrators of genocide or mass atrocity. And I think even if we look at the history of World War II in Europe, we will see that there were also non-state actors who committed atrocious crimes, some of the worst atrocities of World War II. These were radical nationalist movements aspiring to create their own states, especially in Eastern Europe. But despite not being state actors, they committed mass crimes against the Jewish population, against ethnic Poles and others. So I think the state can, of course, be a very dangerous factor, but it doesn't have to be the state only who could be responsible for both everyday hate crimes as well as mass atrocities.
Yeah, it is really good to focus on possibly the most organized and powerful organization. However we want to define states and where the parameters of a state ends and society begins. I think. I want to take a step back here because the discussion of, say, prejudices, racism, and how states, manipulate them and mobilize these popular sentiments, right? People's opinion and sentiments are like clay. They can be shaped into any form. They can be turned into, noble sentiments, like welcoming refugees, or they can be turned into a nasty, semi-genocidal and exclusionary sentiment, like, go back to your own country. We don't want refugees because they are criminals and rapists. That's the kind of rhetoric that you hear from people like Viktor Orban, or the Donald Trump, or even like, average Joe that is less informed than they should be, right? But I think the one thing that I want to bring up here and get your response is, the genocides and other atrocity crimes are perceived and presented as state crimes. Say for instance that Professor the Penny Green and in London, who's a colleague and a friend of mine. She runs the International State Crime Initiative at the Queen Mary University of London. And she's a criminologist, a critical criminologist by training, and then she, and rightly, paints these atrocity crimes as state crimes. But I want to, look at states not just simply as standalone entities. States are socially embedded, right? The states are embedded within society, and so usually, as you know, the term civil society was shelved during the entire Cold War period, although it's a term that came out of European Enlightenment intellectual movement, going back to Immanuel Kant and the Italian Renaissance and whatnot, right? But the term was dusted off from the shelf by Western democratic powers that were, in a power struggle against the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, of which Poland was a component, right? And the Pope John Paul II was involved in promoting civil society, using Catholicism as a counter ideological force against the quote unquote the evil communism, right? So in that regard, in a neo-totalitarian Eastern Bloc was confronted by a powerful civil society forces unleashed through funding and support and media coverage, right? But in sharp contrast to that picture I painted of the progressive role of civil society in confronting and staring down and eventually defeating the really murderous neo-totalitarian Soviet bloc. We, in genocide such as what we are witnessing in, say, Myanmar today, or like Uyghurs in China today, in Shanxi, the civil societies in China and civil society in Burma, if I can use those terms, the term to refer to these two, rather nationalistic and the very racist mainstream societies in China and Burma. What I find myself is that in genocidal crimes, civil society have become uncivil. In other words, murderous itself, and collaborate with the genocidal state, the military or the Communist Party. And that also is something that every genocide scholars found in the case of Nazi genocide. The Nazi Party, relatively a marginal French party in 1923, within 10 years became the most dominant political party in 1933, and Hitler came to power and completely Nazified the entire German civil society, from the very top intellectuals down to the working men and women of Germany during the Third Reich. And so how do you see the role of civil society in state genocide mobilization? Because one of your books that attracted my attention is about popular culture, right? Can you respond to this argument that civil society is inherently civil, civic, progressive? And then in the cases of genocides, that turns out to be completely untrue.
Well, thank you for all these very, very interesting remarks. I largely agree with you. I mean, to the names you mentioned, the important authors of writings about civil society, I would just add one that is very important to me. That is Gramsci, and I think that has to be taken into account. The way he saw civil society as a battlefield, if you like, and the outcome is never fixed.
Yeah, for some of my friends and others who are listening, or whom will listen after the live cast, Antonio Gramsci was a Italian labor activist, organizer, and an intellectual. He was jailed, and he jotted down, numerous notes during his prison time, and they were translated into English language and published as prison notebooks. And that you should definitely check it out. He, just as Raphael Lumpkin gifted us with the word genocide, it was Antonio Gramsci who gifted us with the word hegemony. And so,
yes.
Sorry, I just want to give a little
the
profile of Gramsci.
Actually, we can go back to Gramsci and cultural hegemony when we talk about popular culture. But let's talk about civil society first, because I agree with you that is important. So civil society is a battlefield of if you like to use another metaphor, it's a football pitch, and you have, well, probably more than two teams on the pitch anyway, but the outcome is
no referee.
Well, yeah, that's a good point, definitely. So the outcome is never fixed, or it can never be taken for granted. So I would say civil society automatically doesn't have to be a progressive force, but it can be a progressive force. And of course, there are different forces within civil society. And I think if we look at the history of Central and Eastern Europe, I think we actually have this tradition. And I think Southeast Asia also has a tradition of civil society as an important progressive force or emancipatory force, and that goes back a long time ago. But in more recent times, certainly since the 70s and the 80s, Poland has had this tradition. And many people who are today involved in resisting, the current hegemony of ethno-nationalism, those people come from that tradition of civil society and the democratic opposition in Poland in the 70s and the 80s. So I think as a point of reference, it is actually a good point of reference that is still relevant. And of course, solidarity is the best example of a huge social movement that existed in the 80s and that challenged the authoritarian power of the what in the 80s was a military dictatorship in Poland.
I mean, you're referring to the Gdańsk based labor rights and trade unionist movement that became the most powerful force challenging the Soviet-backed Warsaw regime.
Yes, it started as a trade union in the Gdańsk shipyard, but then it became even much more than a trade union. It really became a social movement and a national movement. At its peak, it had 10 million members in a country of less than 40 million people. So it really became one of the biggest social movements in history that eventually defeated the dictatorship.
Right.
And I think that's you know, that's a very important part of our history. But if we look of what Solidarity is today, it still exists as an organization, but it is much smaller. I think probably around 500,000 members. But what it has become today is a nasty right-wing nationalist organization, which in many ways is the opposite of what it was meant to be and what it was at the beginning in the 1980s. And I think in a way the story of Solidarity in Poland could be seen in parallel to the story of the National League for Democracy in
exactly. I was just going to mention it. You know,
so if there is an emancipatory movement, it can play a positive role, but it does not mean that the role will always stay positive, and its outlook will always stay progressive. So it's always a dynamic kind of situation, and depending on the context, also the you know, our interpretation of history might change, and we might actually, you know, reflect and think of, you know, what went wrong and when, and maybe, you know, some of the early warnings were there, but they were ignored. And I think you probably could give more examples from other countries, including Myanmar.
Yeah, what I want to do is you know, stay on the subject of civil society. You mentioned that, you know, the Southeast Asia, what we call Southeast Asia, you know, that's a terminology that has not been around for long. You know, it's not an ancient linguistic reference like, as you know, South China Sea, right? This is the terminology that emerged out of the United States military intelligence, you know, that map out the entire Asian theater into different, you know, basically operational zones, right? And it's the term Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asia, actually, it's interesting because, you know, of course, we will get into this subject of states in Southeast Asia, because that this is going to be, you know, half of the conversation. You know, the Southeast Asian Supreme Command was based in Kandy, Ceylon, or Sri Lanka today. And so, you know, we don't think of India or Nepal, or no, so not Nepal, sorry, Sri Lanka as part of Southeast Asia, right? We create this label, Southeast Asia, and the parameters are drawn, and we can only think of 10 countries with ASEAN, and peripherally on the fringe, Timor-Leste is wanting to get in and not allowed in, right? So back in 1940s, Southeast Asia encompassed Ceylon as well, and parts of India, right? And so, but be that as it may, you know, the civil society in Southeast Asia only developed in the you know, early nationalist movement phase across you know, Dutch Indies, you know, the Indonesia, the Spain controlled the Philippines, and then, you know, the rest of, you know, French Indochina, and the English or British controlled Malayu, Burma, Singapore, and whatnot, right? And so the civil society in those days, of course, you know, the emerged without regard to what was happening in other places, but they were the civil society nationalist movements Yeah, basically, nationalist movements are civil society movement. Societies were mobilized, people were mobilized, but by radical ideas coming from Europe, right? The revolutionary ideas, Marxist, Leninist, and Gramsci was not known then, and or he was just a kid if he was still was already born. But how do you see the early rise of Southeast Asian states, yeah, and the connection that their colonial roots might have with subsequent and contemporary genocide? In other words, how did civil society and states in Southeast Asia get into this business of genocidal destructions of groups? In Indonesia, 1965, if we want to include Bangladesh, 1971, War of Independence, had that genocidal component. I noticed that in your symposium, one of the leading genocide scholars from Dhaka, Mufidel, was also speaking, right? And then, obviously we've got Cambodia, and today we have Burma, and then we've got 1967, 68, racial killings of Chinese minorities by the Malay dominant groups. And so, how do you see these historical developments, in relation to what you described about Solidarita in Poland and other places?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's another possible interesting analogy with East Central Europe. And I'm not saying that the histories are identical. Of course, they are not. But I do think that there are some interesting parallels. So of course, some traditions of statehood go back hundreds of years, both in Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia. But when we talk about the modern state, of course, it does not directly link with those ancient traditions, and the area of East Central Europe, like the area of Southeast Asia, was occupied by empires. The Russian Empire, Austro-Hungary, the German Empire, and there is a debate whether we should refer to colonization in the case of East Central Europe or not. But I think it is actually secondary. It's not the most important thing what term we use. But the fact is that when the new nation states, the modern nation states, were formed in East Central Europe in the wake of World War I, both the borders and the shape of the nation states were to a large extent arbitrary, because it's not possible to draw the borders, to dictate the shape of a nation state in a neat way, without minorities, without diversity. It was impossible to create homogeneous nation states, because that's just unnatural, because diversity is part and parcel of the fabric of the landscape, of the cultural landscape of the region. But what those new nation states set out to do is to nationalize their territory, which means to make it harder for minorities to live and survive within the borders of the modern nation state. So instead of being an actor that you can call emancipatory, those new nation states often became a factor of oppression towards their own citizens, of different ethnicity or religion. And I think to some extent, of course, the modern nation states in Asia and elsewhere, also resulted from the former sort of colonial policies, borders of administration, and I think in both cases, nationalist ideology became an instrument of consolidating the modern state in a way that often created more problems than it solved, of course. And I think in Myanmar, like in Poland, the diversity that could be and should be cherished was often perceived as something to get rid of or not to appreciate. And I think this is a challenge that is a universal challenge for humanity, for many societies, for many countries. That diversity can be and should be perceived as a value in itself, in my view. But I'm afraid this is not the view that is very widely shared.
Right. Yeah, I think without being too deeply philosophical, just one empirical observation. And you step out of your house and walk into any wooded area, a forest, or a beach, or anything like in the natural environment. What you see is diversity. Plants and trees in different heights and different shapes. Leaves different, colors of flowers are different, right? That's what we have. Like if we look at the world as a garden, right? I mean, it'd be so boring to stare at just bamboos or just like daisies or tulips, right? And the most beautiful garden it's a colorful one with diverse species, right? And so by the same token, the human world, like dress, traditions, food. You don't want to eat like the potato every day. You want like Thai noodles or Chinese stir fry or full English breakfast or whatever, right? So when we have this natural presence and desire for diversity, right? And instead that people are artificially taught to appreciate sameness, instead of not simply tolerating, but embracing diversity in taste and ideas and views, right? The one thing I want to ask you, make a statement and invite you to comment is that you mentioned colonization, and of course, like Poland was sandwiched between different empires. That the Polish borders were drawn and redrawn. Poland, the Polish people were not homogeneous, heterogeneous. In the 14th, 13th century, Poland was the most culturally and intellectually vibrant in Europe. Basically, you accommodated. There's so much so that the Jewish population in Eastern Europe decided that Poland was the most peaceful and welcoming country. So they built their own communities. Like, before the Nazi genocide, Poland was home to the largest and most vibrant Jewish cultural and intellectual community, right? And so if you look at it's because of the Polish state that existed, feudal kingly state that had allowed the diversity to thrive, right? So if we look at the nature of the states across Southeast Asia, I mean, like we could, out of the 10 countries, we could come up with, half of the countries in Southeast Asia that are engaged in some kind of state manipulation and promotion of different type of ethno-religious or toxic racism, like Indonesia, for instance, right? Like after independence from Dutch, Indonesian, the Javanese elite, the move into the direction of ethnicizing the new nation state along the lines of Javanese norms and taste and ideology, Javanization, right? Including moving populations of Javanese people onto other islands so they could dominate electorally, right? The same goes for the Burmese as well. The Burmese state had been ethnicized along the Burmese dominant group, and then like the state was given an official or semi-official ideology as in Buddhism, right? And then Thai, the same thing. Thai had diverse communities, always been a tolerant country, and then the adoption of Buddhism as the official the religion of Thai kingdom, and if you move to Cambodia, there are Cham Muslim minorities and Vietnamese that have lived there for centuries, that they have been turned into minorities, right? And so my argument here is that, Southeast Asian states were not independent creation of in progressive nationalist and civil society movements that succeeded in pushing the European colonizers out of their soil, right? But we inherited colonial states, and the functions of the colonial states were economic exploitation and extraction to the maximum, right? Impoverishing the large majority of the colonized and enriching the European powers back in Europe, in Paris or London or Amsterdam, wherever they may be. And then the second aspect of these colonial states is the racist and repressive DNA that manifested themselves into bureaucratic organizations such as police and courts, right? So in other words, we inherited these massively powerful colonial states, and there was a change of guards at the top. Brown faces became the leaders of newly independent countries, but the DNA of the states, economic exploitation from the center of power, racist orientation of the new dominant power elite, and then the racist orientation of the bureaucracy, right? So these things combined create or set the stage for exclusion and discrimination, and eventually genocidal persecution and destruction of people who became minorities. As you know, minorities are not minorities. The state made them minorities. They are just there. Like in the case of Rohingyas or Chin or Kachin people, they were there. And Burma, as a new modern state, post-colonial, racist, exploitative state, move into their territories and turn them into minorities, right? And so how do you see this, colonial states operating as post-colonial nation states, and what the implications are for the whole of Southeast Asia? I mean, as a Polish intellectual coming in, having a degree of detachment from the things on the ground, you will have a different perspective.
I couldn't agree more with everything that you said, and I would again repeat, I can see many parallels between the Southeast Asian history and the history of my region. So without repeating what you just said, I think it's also interesting that you alluded to the economic aspect of exploitation, or if you like, economic organization within the borders of the nation state. And I think it's interesting because I think for a long time, especially in the 20th century, the idea of self-sufficiency and autarky was popular. And of course, Cambodia under Khmer Rouge was an extreme example of that. But I think by now it is very clear that the nation state as a self-sufficient economic unit is well, the very idea is obsolete.
Well, I mean, it never was viable.
Well, absolutely. But this illusion was very powerful, or this ambition or aspiration was very powerful, and I think in a way it served also as a factor towards self-isolation, which in turn had cultural and social and political repercussions. So I think we have a contrast here between what's economic globalization. Even now, in times of the pandemic, the economic exchange remains global. But to think of the nation state as a self-sufficient unit in any way is dangerous, and not just in economic terms, but of course in cultural, social, and simply human terms. It is an illusion and a dangerous one. But I think popular culture is one other aspect of this subject, and it's also something you mentioned earlier on. Popular culture is both local and global, and just like civil society, it is a battlefield or a pitch, and by definition, it's neither negative or positive. It depends on what kind of values popular culture transmits. It can be dangerous if it transmits, racist or ethno-nationalist ideologies, which has happened a lot historically and still happens today. That includes the online space, the social media, that can be a very dangerous tool of racist and radical nationalist ideology. And again, we have seen it in Myanmar in the case of Facebook and the Rohingya genocide. The Never Again Association participates in a project, Get the Trolls Out, which is an international project trying to combat Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred in the online space. But that's very difficult. But it's an important battlefield as well. But I also want to say that popular culture can play a positive role. And also the internet can play a positive role as a bridge between peoples and cultures. But it very much depends on people themselves, and it very much depends on the active audience of popular culture. And I think in Southeast Asia today, we see interesting phenomena in this field, and even the three finger salute is from a movie, okay? And it's an interesting detail showing that that popular culture could be a resource for for progressive action, or a point of reference for progressive activities, as well as awareness. And I think there are, of course, many more examples of that. But I think popular culture can be both, both a problem and a part of the problem and part of the solution. But it very much depends on the active audiences of culture.
Right. Yeah, you talk about popular culture as a potentially positive as well as negative force, in the face of these states, with colonial and racist DNA. States are ethnicized or racialized, right? And also, I think, like, what I would be interested to hear is the economic aspect, because we talk about ideology, as in racism, state sponsored, state mobilized, or popular, quote unquote, in organic prejudices, and then obviously, like, we need to make it clear, in my view, that people having prejudices, do not necessarily lead to the genocides, right? Genocides are large scale, the premeditated, systemic and systematic, acts of destruction of entire group, in whole or in part, and that can only be done with the systematic efforts and involving the militia, state, the armies, and the whatnot, and including law as an instrument, right? But it is, I wouldn't say human nature, but it appears almost given that the people are going to be prejudicial. Short people are going to be prejudiced against the tall people. Based on physical appearances, like people automatically make judgments, and then when we make judgments, we became prejudiced, right? We become biased in favor of or against something or some group, but that does not automatically and never necessarily lead to destruction of other communities, right? And the states, that's where the states come in, right? That's why the nature of the state becomes extremely important. If states are turned into progressive, enlightened, and compassionate organizations, right? Caring for the poor, the vulnerable, the single mom, the excluded minorities, and whatnot, then, like, these states can mitigate against the excesses of the society that may attempt to express themselves in a rather violent and devastating ways towards those that that are excluded and discriminated against, like LGBTs, or people with like different ideas, right? But do you think that if states are bad, and in other words, if states are manipulating public sentiment in ways that promote racism or xenophobia or right-wing ideologies or Islamophobia, right? These are like, these have like a fascist qualities, ultimately and eventually they lead to destruction of vulnerable communities, right?
Mm.
Do you think that education is sufficiently powerful tool to counter mobilization by very, very organized, highly resourced, and highly mobilized organizations such as, say, Catholic Church or Buddhist order, or the the, what you call it, military organizations, or, as you say, radical nationalist groups? So how should we counter these mobilizations of popular prejudices to turn them into genocidal proportions?
Well, I think one more word that we have not used today yet is resistance, and I think the idea of resistance, has also many different shapes, and it can be expressed on many different levels. But I think that that is important. That is also part of the tradition that we have in Poland. Of course, going back to World War II and the anti-Nazi resistance, but also going back to earlier periods. This can be armed resistance, but it could also be an expression of resistance in other ways. So in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jewish resistance included both armed resistance, and of course the most famous example is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. But the resistance also included underground education or underground religious services that were prohibited by the Nazis, and so on and so on. Underground newspapers, an underground archive created by historians led by Emanuel Ringelblum. These were very important elements of the resistance. So education, yes, I think it is one part of that, but I would understand education in much broader sense than what happens in the school. As a teacher myself, I know that the school and the university is one of the settings of education, but it is not the only one, and maybe even not the most important one nowadays. There are many other spaces of socialization, and we already talked about some of them, about the online space, the space of popular culture, etc., but also the space of religious institutions. And once again, I think religion can be a part of the problem, as we already mentioned, both in Central and Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia. There are clear examples of that. But it can also be part of the solution. And of course, the role of leadership is important here, including the role of faith leaders. And one of the really interesting elements of the symposium we talked about was the conversation between the chief rabbi of Poland, Michael Szudry, and our friend Venerable Lablu Barua from Thailand. And I think this is the kind of dialogue that is also important. The more dialogue, the more cooperation between people of different faiths, including leaders, including religious figures, the better. And I think one of the valuable elements of the legacy of John Paul II, who was the Polish-born Pope, was the dialogue with Jews, with Muslims, with other religious groups, which was not easy to accept by many Catholics. Still is not. But I think it is important, and I can tell you a little anecdote. One of the most extraordinary emails I received in my life some years ago was the following. It said, "I know about the Never Again Association, and I know about your campaign, Let's Kick Racism Out of the Stadiums. You might be interested to know that I was in one team with Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II." And that was an email from his Jewish schoolmate in the town of Wadowice in the 1930s. And they really played together in one football team. His name was Jerzy Kluger, and Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope, was the goalkeeper in a mixed Polish-Jewish team, and that's a great story. Actually, Jerzy Kluger survived the war, survived the Holocaust, and then he lived in Rome. And when Karol Wojtyła became the Pope, he moved to Rome, obviously, and they reunited. And then Jerzy Kluger played a big role in organizing this very historic visit of John Paul II to Jerusalem, which was a very important moment in the history of reconciliation between Christian and Jews.
Yeah,
so this level is not the only level. You know, religion is not the only way to solve conflicts or stop genocides. But I think the role and the responsibility of faith leaders is important. Also on the subject of combating genocide denial, which was our starting point for the conversation, of course.
Yeah, just on the point about this heartwarming story that you shared that just with us here. You know, as you know, in the Jewish ghetto or Kashmir in the Krakow, right? That's been the Jewish area for the last 600-700 years, right? In Krakow, right? When Krakow was the city of the kings, right? The seat of the Polish intellectual, cultural, and political power. And there's a synagogue there where our Polish guides mentioned that the visit and the sermon of reconciliation that John Paul II delivered at that synagogue to the small Jewish community that returned to Krakow after the Holocaust, right? Krakow had about 75 or 70,000 Jewish, Poles, before the Holocaust, and only several thousands, returned, and then most of the Jews there were quote unquote liquidated or mass slaughtered, right, in Auschwitz and other places. And so apparently, the late Pope's childhood ties with his Jewish friend remain very strong in him. Yeah? But of course, that's more at the personal level, or translating into reconciliatory and I would say enlightened papal policies towards the Jewish community, right? The one issue that I want your response from. How do you see the interstate systems? Because as you know, no genocide could be committed by a standalone state without the culpability and I would say complicity, active or inactive, of the states. That's why we've got in, you're a prominent genocide scholar yourself, the concept of bystanding states, people who stood by, right? I think we need to talk about it because we can blame the Nazis for the genocide, or we can blame the Turkish nationalists for the Armenian genocide, or the Germans for what happened in Africa in 1905, right? That was the first the genocide of the last 20th century, 1905, German, committing genocide, and Germany itself had acknowledged it recently and came up with the financial compensation, right? And so I live in UK, where colonial genocides had never been acknowledged. Winston Churchill continues to be held up as this extremely moral, upright, and patriotic leader. Churchill was a horrible racist, but empirically and objectively speaking, involved in different types of, the famine, as a matter of policy, took the food away from Bengali people just to sustain the British troop in Africa. You see what I mean? It's like Irish famines. It's the same thing, right? Famines are rarely natural occurrences, that they are results of direct policies, right? Made by someone else. And so what is the role of interstate systems? So we talk about education and the need to go beyond classroom education. And you very rightly mentioned resistance, including armed resistance. We both are familiar with the INGO world, and at the minute you mention resistance, every donor would run away from you. Right? So we want to be intellectually honest with ourselves and with those who we work with, right? These liberal Oxford education doesn't help. As you know, like Viktor Orban was educated at Oxford, so was Aung San Suu Kyi, yeah. And then these leaders, themselves get involved in some kind of like a fascist or neo-fascist mobilization against Muslims in Poland, as well as sorry, not Poland, but in Hungary. But Polish national elites were also very well educated in places like Oxford or Harvard. Look where Poland is heading today, right? So obviously, liberal education classroom have not enlightened them. The same way Harvard did not enlighten Hitler's deputies, like Albert Speer, who was Harvard educated, became the Minister of War and War Production, right? And so, can you share your thoughts on the role of neighboring and international states in allowing genocide mobilizations and actual acts of perpetrating genocides?
Well, thank you. That is important. Well, genocide never happens in secret. It's simply impossible. It's not feasible to keep it a secret. Even in Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, they could not manage to stop any information being transmitted to the outside world. And once we know about it and we don't act on the information, we become co-responsible as bystanders. And let me tell you another story from the history of my country. This is the story of Jan Karski that is very important to us.
You mean the journalist?
Well, he was an army officer. He was a Polish officer in the underground who himself went to the ghettos and collected information about the plight of the Jewish people in the German occupied Poland, and then he managed to get this information personally to the West. So he worked with the Polish government in exile in London, and he met with with high-level officials in the UK and in the US, including a famous meeting with President Roosevelt.
There's a statue of him in the Jewish ghetto in Krakow.
Yes.
I think he took his own life in the end.
Well,
are we talking about the same person? Or
no, I think you are referring to Shmuel Zygielbojm, who was a member of the Polish Parliament of exile, a Jewish leader. The story is similar. I mean, he also tried to raise alarm in the West with little or no result, and then he committed suicide in protest. But Jan Karski, he did his best. I mean, he went to the highest levels of the Western establishment, trying to raise alarm at the genocide of the Jews in Poland, and he did not manage to get the reaction, a meaningful reaction, and he died just 2 decades ago, and he later became an academic in the US. But for the rest of his life, he had a sense of guilt. He said, "Well, I did not manage to persuade the leaders of the Western world to react meaningfully to the Holocaust." And his story is very important to us because in the last years of his life, he was also a good friend and supporter of the Never Again Association. And he wrote us letters saying, "Well, our generation failed, but your generation must be wiser." It's a big challenge to have such words from this kind of man with this kind of biography. And I think, again, if we think about the responsibility of the international community, of the global community, we cannot forget that story. And if we think about Myanmar today, none of us can say we don't know what has happened. If we think about the Rohingya, and if we think about other atrocities that are happening as we speak, the information is there, but there are just so many people, so many institutions, so many actors who prefer not to say anything, not to do anything. And of course, the United Nations is often the one institution expected to be a solution to the world's problems. And I would like to say that I think the United Nations is overall a good institution. We may disagree on that, but I think United Nations has done a lot of good in the post-war period, and of course it results from the experience of World War II. But we also know it has failed many times vis-a-vis ongoing genocides. But there are also other institutions. Again, I know that the European Union is not the same as ASEAN, but in some ways they are also similar. And there is a lot of discussion in Europe today. What should the European do vis-a-vis the authoritarian regimes in Poland and Hungary? Is the reaction adequate? Is it not? There is some reaction, but it is slow. So obviously these are very different historical cases, but the whole idea about being responsible for each other and being in solidarity with each other within the global community or within a regional community, I think it is important. And you know better than anyone else that there is also discussion in ASEAN. What to do with Myanmar, what to do with other cases of human rights abuses, and I think nobody so far has a perfect solution, and none of those institutions have done enough.
Yeah. Let me just interrupt for a second on both the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the United Nations, right? I think the UN is known to be the organization or the playground of big imperial powers, and so like one of the undersecretaries that I met at an airport lounge in Dhaka when I was visiting Bangladesh refugee camps, where the Rohingya Muslims were kept without their rights and recognition as legal refugees, right? And she said, she's Bangladeshi. She said, UN is all about geopolitics, right? And I think it is she was very truthful and honest, but it is also a damning characterization of the organization, because like if you look at even like Churchill's writings or Roosevelt's writing, that these were guys who built the United Nations, or at least I sowed the seeds for the United Nations that grew, right? And including Stalin, right? And so, it's hard to imagine that Stalin was one of the founders of the United Nations, right? And along with Churchill and Roosevelt, right? The term United Nations, it is a term that has lost its original moral meaning. Nations united against the evil of crimes against humanity. Crimes at the time there was no the genocide as a legal crime, right? The crime of aggression, crime against peace. These are legal crimes that the Nuremberg trials used to try the Nazi high-level commanders and officials, right? So when we have an organization such as the United Nations with almost 200 member states, yeah, moving away from the original moral imagination and moral purpose, which was like nations staying united against any form of evil acts or force or processes, and like genocide is as evil as a crime gets, right? And so that's one thing. And so Security Council is completely paralyzed, right? All the 5 permanent veto powers are divided along their geopolitical and ideological interests, right? And then we've got Association of Southeast Asian Nations that had allowed, several genocides or like cases of like a racist, large-scale violence in, like southern Thailand, the Mindanao in Philippines, Burma, Cambodia, right? And so I think one of the I commend Southeast Asian nations, particularly ASEAN recently, for basically drawing the line, and ASEAN is not known for its human rights defense. It's known for its authoritarianism among the member states. And yet even ASEAN finds it unbearable to let Burma to move in this direction continually, right? And so I think there's some silver lining, something to work with, and we want to thank the ASEAN leaders for taking this stand. But at the same time, there's a problem. You talk about like in the symposium, like distortion, and one of the ways you can distort a clearly well-documented genocidal criminal case is to turn it into a humanitarian issue, humanitarianizing an international crime, right? That is one form of distortion. It's not outright denial, but it takes resources and focus and the political will away from the crux of the issue. The crux of the issue is that an ASEAN state is perpetrating a crime of genocide, and which is also a crime against humanity, in violation of ASEAN principles to uphold human rights, and in violation of the Genocide Convention, which is a binding interstate treaty signed by 150 member states. And so these are the issues that cough up, and I realize that UN does have a positive aspects, and I will not just like dismiss the UN as completely useless, right? But when it matters, UN has kept on failing. When it matters, the ASEAN has kept on failing.
Well, it's hard to disagree with you again, but the convention that you mentioned, it is of course one of the cornerstones of the so-called UN system, and we of course talked about it a little bit during our symposium, in your own presentation, as well as in a previous session. The UN Convention on Genocide, the result of the years of work of Rafal Pankowski and others. Of course, it grows out of the experience of the Holocaust and World War II. It has not prevented many other genocides that happened post World War II, unfortunately, sadly. But it is there as a point of reference. I completely agree with you. It should not be the only point of reference in talking about genocide, because I agree with you completely. The sort of legalistic preoccupation with the definition is not the best approach. And of course, we should also, think of genocide in broader terms as a historical, as a social phenomenon, and not only a legally defined crime in a narrow way. But the convention is a point of reference that has become a universal point of reference. So when we talk with our friends in Cambodia, they all refer to the convention, and they are very interested in learning about how the convention came about. And I think this is also one of the bridges for building intercultural solidarity and empathy. So when we conducted seminars in Cambodia on the history of the Holocaust and the issue of genocide and dealing with the past, we could refer to the convention as something that is a common point of reference for the history of Poland, as well as the history of Cambodia. And we don't just need to consider the legal aspect of the convention, but I think also a very important moral and symbolic aspect and meaning of the convention. And I think the kind of global awareness and solidarity is key here. And solidarity, of course, doesn't only work on the level of international organizations. It works, and it should work on the level of social movements and on the level of people, on the level of grassroots. Of course, grassroots activities by definition are local, but it could also have a global dimension, an international dimension, and I think that is very important. Without the sort of grassroots awareness of global issues, those international institutions would never work properly unless the citizens of the world make them function properly.
Of course, yeah. Let me just interject, and then get your final thoughts on on a way forward. For historical records, as we're on the subject of states in Southeast Asia and the crimes that they have committed against their own citizens. We touched on the idea of bystanding state, like states allowing crimes to unfold right before their eyes, because stopping the perpetration of those crimes do not advance their strategic interest, right? That's why, like you mentioned about Jankowski, right? There is a book on my shelf here. It's called "London Has Been Informed," right? In other words, London knew and London did not do anything because it's not in their interest. The British at the time were more keen to get Hitler's cooperation on anti-Soviet military intelligence collaboration, because the feudal powers of the power in London was more concerned about flushing out radical communists from the British society and institutions such as Cambridge and others, right? Than saving millions of people's lives in the hands of the Nazis, right? And also you talk about like Cambodians and their reference to Genocide Convention. What's interesting for the listeners is the Cambodian genocide was ended by the Vietnamese military intervention. The Vietnamese troop coming in with the support of people like Hon Son, who was a Khmer Rouge regional commander, who defected to the Vietnamese when atrocities started to happen, right? But in those days, the United States, United Kingdom, the Kingdom of Thailand, and some of the ASEAN member states, as well as China, collaborated to put Khmer Rouge regime back in power in Phnom Penh, right? China financially pumped in hundreds of millions of dollars for Khmer Rouge to regroup and Thailand provided sanctuary along Khmer-Thai borders, sealed off so the Cambodian, the Khmer Rouge regime could regroup without the media scrutiny. The United States and United Kingdom backed the Khmer Rouge at the United Nations, presenting them as the sole legitimate representative of Cambodian people after the facts about their atrocity came to light. And so, these are important facts that we need to, keep in mind. And they're not just a bystander states. They were actively supporting post-genocide Khmer Rouge regime expelled from Phnom Penh. That's just for the historical records that we cannot allow the amnesia here. Yeah, and of course, paradoxically, the United States became the largest donor for the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Maybe like the Americans want to wash their guilt with hundreds of millions of dollars pumping into the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. But the point that I want to get your opinion on, and if we look at the Black Lives Matter, it is the most powerful progressive ideological movement that is taking place within what you would call like popular culture, right? Like, I mean, we both like football, you watch football games and teams and, different skin color players taking the knee, yeah? And then people love it. Of course, like, there are people who boo. The racists will always boo against any type of anti-racist gesture, including British Home Minister Priti Patel. she said this is gesture politics. Of course, like, gesture politics is very important and powerful. So is it conceivable for us as grassroots organizers and intellectuals who are opposed categorically to any form of genocidal racism, including against LGBT people, right? To start a movement that may eventually result in shift in popular consciousness, because today, like, slavery is impossible. It is not thinkable, right? That some form of slavery may exist in fisheries in Thailand and other places, but classical form of slavery is no longer possible. Slave trade is not possible, not thinkable. Yeah, the classical form of colonization is not thinkable, not even by countries like Russia. Russia would not think of like colonizing Ukraine, right? So, is this the direction we should go? And what are the things should we be doing to get popular consciousness shifted to the point that genocidal racism, let alone genocidal killings, is unthinkable as humans?
That is very interesting. I do agree with you about the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course it is often misunderstood, and I think especially in Eastern Europe it is often criticized simply out of ignorance. Just 2 weeks ago, I spoke at a conference of the Russian Jewish Congress in Moscow, and it was a panel about sports, actually, sports as a problem and as a solution in the area of anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. And I was asked this question: what do you think about Black Lives Matter by a leading Russian sports journalist? And I said very openly, I think it's a great movement, and I think the audience, maybe some people in the audience, were a little surprised. What I think is great about Black Lives Matter in the field of sports is the fact that it comes from the players themselves, and the players can be very significant role models, as we know. on a global scale. When I was in Yangon, everybody was watching Premier League, and you know it's a global phenomenon, of course. And of course, the movement is much more than about sports, but the involvement of the players has been very significant. And I think what is really interesting here is also that it is a case which is on the edge, if you like, of popular culture that we talked about, and social movements that we talked about. And I think in a way what our organization, the Never Again Association, has tried to do for years is actually quite similar. So we have always wanted to be active in the field of education in the broad sense, and especially education in the field of popular culture. So popular culture as a space of informal education is very important to us. That includes, for example, the Polish Woodstock Festival that is organized annually on the Polish-German border, which is the biggest music festival in Europe, with about 500,000 people there every year. Which is also a fantastic opportunity for education, and that's where Never Again is active every year. And our mutual friend from the Free Rohingya Coalition attended the festival, and we were very happy to host him there. Well, I can show you another example. One of our campaigns for years has been the Music Against Racism campaign, and this is a recently released record.
Jedna Rasa.
Excuse me?
Jedna Rasa. Those are names of the artists.
Well, we have Polish artists, we have British artists, we have Chumbawamba, we have Zion Train, we have a good lineup, and it's one of the examples of how popular music can also be an educational platform, and I think, well, it's a long march strategy, if I can use a
I think maybe what
metaphor.
we should do is have a massive international rock concert in a place like Phnom Penh, where the country is so aware of genocide and the dangers of genocide to societies and people. I think, there will be so many musicians that we can involve in and have a physical musical concert. Just like with the genocide, Never Again as the slogan. It's like make poverty history kind of concert. But I think that's a way to go. I think maybe Europe is culturally the shifting towards right. Poland, your own country, is moving in the rightest direction, rather disturbingly. But maybe with the opening in the ASEAN, maybe we could even get some of the authoritarian states to recognize that genocide is something that every state, whatever the orientation, has to draw the line against, right? Well, so I think that's something we should seriously consider, the using popular culture to shift at least the popular consciousness among the Southeast Asia, one region at a time.
That is a very good idea, and I could just add that we are proud to have among our friends of the Never Again Association some of the rock artists, both in Europe but also in the region of Southeast Asia. That includes Cambodian Space Project, a great band, or Rebel Riot in Myanmar.
I think. Well, a lot of Thai progressive bands would play, Indonesian bands, and also we can bring in bigger international names, that will be very much interested. So let's have a separate, conversation, meeting on this. Okay, we are already in our 40 minutes mark. It's been a real pleasure. Just let me give you just a minute or two for your final thoughts, and then we will end the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. It is always a pleasure and an honor to debate with you. I remember our personal conversations in South Korea 2 years ago now, well, almost 3 years now. And I believe we do have a global movement of solidarity. I wish it was stronger, but it exists, and I think it has a potential, and we have a good network of friends, of colleagues, experts, activists, and I think obviously the challenges are huge, and the global challenges of right-wing extremism, populism, racism, nationalism. These are common challenges of mankind, of humankind. But it is definitely up to us, each of us, if we can deal with them, overcome, and win.
Yeah, thank you so much, all my friends and all our friends in Southeast Asia and other places. You've been listening to the Professor Rafal Pankowski of Collegium, the Civitas in Warsaw. He's based in Warsaw, and he's also co-founder of Never Again Association, and a tireless, grassroots organizer and educator, traveling between Southeast Asia and Poland. And so you're listening to the FOSI dialogue on democratic struggles across Asia, and obviously we would address issues that concerns any oppressed community, irrespective of their geographic location. And Rafal, thank you so much, and you have the rest of the you have a good rest of the day. Okay.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah, we'll talk again privately. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.